We look at the way that the net has developed and its impact on people psychologically and collectively. In some ways it conforms to paradigms of imaginative experience that we've had in the past. I mean, it's not without accident that when that movie The Matrix came out, which seemed in many ways to presage or crystallize a lot of thinking about the virtual world, that people immediately referenced Gnosticism and said, this is in many ways a kind of Gnostic view. It was kind of, very much a forward to the past view about what these technologies are. And I think there's some truth in that. People have always had an ulterior and imaginative life. Sometimes it's been collective. You can argue that various forms of religious experience, in some ways have an affinity with what people are doing when they engage with the World Wide Web through the internet. That many myriads of people are engaging in a world that is not immediately apprehensible to the senses, but can only be accessed through this specialized set of devices, much as you might say that the religious experience can only be accessed through a specific set of rituals and through the interposition of certain kinds of kind of technological efficiency, if you like. So, maybe there is something going on here, that this is just another evolution of things humans have been doing for a long while. Where it differs, though, I think, is in the way that the kind of the web experience, the internet experience, is very fragmenting and very anomic. It doesn't follow rules. The rules that are, indeed, it seems to encourage a kind of fissiparous tendency in humans to break up into smaller and smaller agglomerations and to use it to find, as it were, kind of what they're looking for, usually in quite a dark way. And the other kind of pivotal experience for me around all of this virtual technology was actually a report I did for Philips, the electronics company, way back in the 1980s. And at that time they were looking at the very, very early computer games and video games and asked me as a writer, maybe the late 80s, I guess, to look at what I thought these games might be like. And again, I'm not saying I'm making great claims for my prescience, but what I did realize was that these were not going to be narrative mediums in the way that we commonly understood them. They were going to be narrative mediums, they were going to be games, and they were going to demand of the player that the player advance themselves incrementally using various forms of incentive. And my hunch at that point, which does seem to have been confirmed, is that the most popular forms of these games would be determined by sex and violence. Well, sex is less successful, it seems to me, because of the current resources of virtuality. But violence, of course, has been extraordinarily successful, and in a way, the dominance of the first-person shooter game in the video games market seems to me evidence that violence is the lowest and most effective common denominator of people's willingness to suspend disbelief in a virtual mode. In the realm of the social, one could argue that social media represent the sexual arm of this. That they are replete with an idea that is implicit in romanticism, actually, in romantic thinking, which is that there are a myriad of possible encounters out there, of which one is optimal, one is mandated for all space and all time. And in a way, the kind of social media plays to people's romantic yearnings at a very, very strong level, and it animates them to continually re-engage with it on the promise, on a rather licentious promise, but with a rather romantic payoff. And I think that that's why it has such a kind of insidious and overpowering impact, particularly on young people's minds in that way. So you've got these two broad things. On the one hand, you have a kind of ulterior experience, almost akin to a religious experience, a sense of being out of body, a sense of being involved in an arena that is not the ordinarily understood social arena or cultural arena even. Then you have the fissiparous, the fragmenting tendency, the way in which you don't have to be a part of a collectivity. You seem to be, you almost think of the internet as a realm in which Crowley's maxim, do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, is kind of acted out in the way that everybody behaves. You're a paedophile, you're into sadomasochism, you're into bestiality, or, you're a kind of young conservative with rather sinister tendencies in some other direction. You're a fascist, you're a communist, you're this, you're an anarchist, you're a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, whatever you are, you have the potential to find confreres of various kinds in this realm. So you have these two things going on, and you have the enormous impulses of sex and violence that seem to be given free rein in one form or another. And I think what happens then, and what seems to be increasingly happening, is that people in a way upload their imagination to the web. You know, people have uploaded their imagination in the past, they've uploaded it into this religious realm, they've uploaded into earlier media. I mean, you can, in some ways, you can see the same kinds of moral panics being acted out in relation to print media with the explosion of print technology in the late 19th century. You know, contemporary commentators at that time were saying some of the same kinds of things. Shop girls will kind of lose their morals because they read too many of these shilling novelettes, or you can certainly see it with cinema in the early 20th century. You can see it with popular music as you go on through the century, and its mechanized forms of mass access. You can see it with TV, and now you see it with the web. So I don't think there's anything necessarily, I think the thing that is unusual about the internet and the World Wide Web is how uncollective an experience it is. Because in a way, all of these other mediums, because of their very visibility, their very kind of presence and salience, their discoverability, are more obviously policed by the same kinds of social and moral codes that have always been in operation. Not true for the internet. Some people might say that that's its strength, that's its kind of that's why it's kind of interesting and kind of democratic, the sort of WikiLeaks or indeed Wikipedia or indeed Wiki anything view of the web, which is that it is. And other people may see it as more worrying, in the sense that as we have a generation who grow up in this environment, that it will, in a sense, undermine their ability to suspend disbelief in some of those more collective modes of imagining. One of the paradigms for the way in which we relate with people on the internet actually isn't social media, it's e-commerce. And when we click and buy something on Amazon or any other website, we have reduced a very complex, mediated and personalized experience to an utterly anonymous and simple experience. You know, the act of, for example, going into a bookshop, speaking to an assistant, discussing what books are good, discussing what you like to read, being shown where the books are, making the purchase. That was a relatively rich and engaged and nuanced human experience in which you would be looking at somebody's face, checking their body language, looking at their visage. I mean, that was a relationship. Now that's completely gone at that point. Into that vacuum comes the avatar, comes the way in which people wish to project themselves into the notionally anonymous playing field of social websites. So, it's as if the medium sucks away and strips you of all your contingent characteristics as a person. You're free of your gender, of your race, of your class, of your nationality, of your age, of your sexual identity, your appearance. All of these things that you might argue are in some way contingent to your being are kind of gone. And the same is true, of course, with whoever you interact with. But in a way, I think the medium is the message here, because the message is you can be whoever you want in this medium. But what people fail to realise, of course, is that it's true for everybody else as well. And what people who are kind of gullible and in a sense are kind of nascent and untrained in terms of personal bonds that have a contingent aspect, what they're very vulnerable to is the fact that people may be preying upon that exact gulf between who they think they're interacting with and who they really are interacting with. And of course there are kind of obvious and egregious cases of this. I mean, the one that haunts everybody is the notion of the paedophile grooming the child on the internet. But in fact that is just that, an egregious example that in a way seeks to diffuse the many, many lesser examples of this that are going on all the time. But when I log on to buy a book from a huge online retailer, and that huge online retailer already puts up, W self, you might like this or you might like that, it seems to be posing as my friend, but it's not saying to me, W self, this is a book of the kind that you've bought in the past, but you know what, you should really broaden your reading, and I've noticed that you're rather gummed down in this sort of stuff, and you might like to consider this, or some interesting books on this subject are coming out, or have you not thought, and so on. Or it might even, if it was my friend, it might come up, the large online book retailer, and say, look, you've been spending too much money on books recently, don't you think you should get out a bit more and not sit there kind of buying stuff. So all sorts of aspects of the internet masquerade, or websites masquerade, as potentially personalized relationships that of course are really anonymous at a very, very fundamental level. So the internet promises us the idea, or various kind of websites promises the idea of actualizing ourselves in an essential way, and then in fact we fall victim to a much, much cruder kind of sorting into types of people. And I think, if that's happening just with online retailing, of course in social networking sites it's happening all the time, which is why there's such fertile grounds for all sorts of bullying and psychological manipulation. People's virtual friends are in inverse correlation to their actual friends, and that's surely because people who actually find it difficult to develop the kind of social skills that are involved in retaining and advancing friendships and keeping friendships find it in some way kind of easier to operate in this virtual realm where they don't have to be who they contingently are. But the price to be paid for that is one of kind of loneliness. Sort of the late Willie Donaldson said, promiscuity is the M1 to loneliness, and there's a kind of wanton promiscuity about the way in which you simply have to poke somebody or kind of send them a message or identify yourself on these social media sites, and you're in some sense have a presence to this many people. I think the other phenomenon that of course is going on there is how much it links in to the celebrity culture, and how much it's a rather strange fulfillment of Warhol's in the future everybody will be famous for 15 minutes, and I think that people's kind of rage and kind of anger that they're not famous is also kind of worked off through these social media sites, just as it's worked off through the spectacle of reality television shows, which of course are platforms for people who have no intrinsic talent at all, in other words, have no contingencies that would make them famous, are made famous. So that the reality TV shows are like the TV version, inverted, of what's going on these social media sites. And none of these are kind of, to put it rather simply, none of them are very nice in terms of what happens to people psychologically. Of course, all of these sites can in some ways be used responsibly by people who have kind of well-defined boundaries. But I sometimes wonder whether or not those kind of people are not the ones who are particularly attracted to them, that they seem inherently like a moth to a flame to attract people who are vulnerable. We don't live in an especially violent culture at the moment. This is not a notably violent society. You think of contemporary British society, and I'm not sure it's egregious violence that I'm necessarily interested in or worried about. And in many ways, some people might argue that the young people who are sitting at home cyberbullying or manipulating on social networking sites, or watching hardcore pornography, or playing violent first-person shooter games, are not out in the streets doing it. There might be an argument that the people are actually committing low-level and even higher-level acts of crime and kind of social uh, disruption are those who are excluded from this new wired world of license that is available to perhaps kids who are from a more affluent background. But it's more this kind of this anomie, this alienation that concerns me, and this febrility of the imagination. And you see it in a lot of screen-based media, where it's now possible with CGI and with the kinds of levels of effects that are available from 3D effects and computer manipulation of images. Nobody has to make much of an effort to suspend disbelief in things. You want to see what it looks like if somebody's liver explodes out of their body. It can be done convincingly. And it's this combination between this kind of, it's all happening on a screen. There's no kind of disjunction between, the screen of a car, the screen of a computer, the screen of, the screen-based life, and the fact that it is effortless in a way. The stimulus of purchasing something, the stimulus of communicating with another kind of anonymous or invented avatar, the stimulus of shooting something that's itself unreal in a first-person shooter game, the stimulus of looking at pornography. These are very kind of visceral, very primary reasons for interacting, and they don't require effort. They're effortless, and they don't require any suspension of disbelief in the ordinarily understood way. I mean, if you like, the most kind of antithetical form, in a way, would be something like opera, which nowadays requires quite an effort of suspension of disbelief, that you have to will a belief in it. There's something about the act of will involved in believing in preposterous things that I believe is the very kind of muscle and key of having an imagination. And if you are spoon-fed everything's plausible, everything is within the same patina of reality in that way, I wonder what these younger people are going to be like. It seems to me that you have a screen, you have a keyboard, you have a mouse, you have a situation where you can flick in one instant from buying an oven glove to using the oven glove to perform frottage or at any rate seeing somebody use the oven glove to perform frottage on an underage, non-consensual sexual partner, to a situation where you're on a social media site and you're asking whether people want to indulge in oven glove sexcapades of one kind or another, that all of these things are taking place on the same screen, as it were. So that's why I think that it plays very strongly to suspension of disbelief or lack of it. In other words, there's a point at which all of these things can seem equivalently real because they're taking place within the same arena. Ordinarily, when you walk around, of course, we have a not particularly unconscious mind that is preoccupied by sexuality and by violence, but we know absolutely what the difference is between that and the external world, or the world of social codes and social mores. Indeed, if we don't, we're insane, and we are treated as such. It's a form of psychosis. But here you have an arena which you can interact with, which is inherently psychotic in that way, that all of these things have the same kind of equivalence, the same kind of, to use a fancy term, the same kind of ontological status. They're equally real. And I just don't know what the minds of people who spend a great deal of time in that particular realm are going to be like. But I think it's worrying. I mean, from what I observe already in young people who spend a lot of time on the web, it definitely gives me cause for anxiety. I think my view of the internet, unfortunately, hasn't changed much over the years since its inception. And I worry sometimes that that's a conceptual and a generational thing, that slightly older people, if you like, reached adulthood before the internet existed, are always going to have a conceptual problem with it, as they do with any majorly transformative technologies in this way. So, just to sort of prefigure anything I might say about the kind of moral effects of this medium or this means of communication, I have to kind of make that statement that, I well remember I was running a business in the late 1980s, early 90s, and a man came to sell me the idea of the internet, and I couldn't actually figure out what he was talking about. I couldn't actually see what one would use it for, and I know that seems like a kind of strange idea 20 odd years down the line, but that actually was the case. And I think then if I look towards the kind of early to mid 90s, I remember writing a piece at that time, kind of that in some ways kind of presages some of the issues that have now arisen around the internet, in that my anxiety at that point was that people would become emotionally and intellectually dependent upon it, more so than practically dependent upon it. I don't think even at that point, although the dot-com boom was about to get underway, I quite grasped the implications of e-commerce. But I did sort of get the idea that people were going to be communicating and conceptualizing much more in a effectively virtual space, and relying upon that virtual space for their information in a way that they hadn't beforehand. By that time, by the mid-1990s, I was already thinking in terms of vulnerable people, or at any rate people who were whose kind of ego boundaries, to use a rather pop psychological term, were perhaps becoming rather fluid and rather indeterminate, finding themselves in some ways merging with this virtual space, identifying with themselves as virtual people rather than actual people, and having a kind of semi-permeable sense of who they were. And I wondered and mused at that time, and this is going back a decade and a half, whether there might, if the internet crashed in some way, whether or not these people might also crash. They might psychologically crash in that way. And I think that anybody who started to think about the internet at that time as an emergent technology, although it would be kind of arrogant and kind of incorrect in my case to say that we in any way foretold the rise of social media sites, I think we were thinking about the kinds of things that might be implied by something like social media sites were they to actually exist. This was all just off the back of seeing the obsessional involvement with email and the obsessional involvement with actually kind of surfing the web itself. But of course, by the mid-1990s, internet chat rooms of one sort or another were beginning to get going as well, even though that they were somewhat recherche taste. And I think none of this really kind of exploded until there was broadband. So I've always had these concerns about how people are going to interact psychologically through the internet and with the World Wide Web. I've always been very, very suspicious of what's involved in it, seeing my own behaviour really around the internet and the web, though I've never been particularly tempted into chat rooms. I could see that, were I younger perhaps, were I slightly different, were I kind of vulnerable in different ways to the ways I am, that is something that would be attractive. I mean, all of us who interact with the web via the internet know how obsessive compulsive it is. And if we don't admit to it, we're lying. We've all done it. We've all senselessly checked our email, or, I personally don't have anything to do with social networking sites, but I can imagine that they're even more compulsive because there is a facility there for constantly seeing whether somebody's noticing you. And then that's the sort of crux of, so that kind of experience, and then you see with kids who play the games obsessively that quite clearly they're going on gaming in their minds even when they're not on the console. And if access is denied to this instant feedback device, people become very much like laboratory rats who are denied a hit of cocaine, having become accustomed to them. And it doesn't really take much imagination to wonder, well, what would it be like in once, as undoubtedly will be the case, once the technology improves to the point that the virtuality is that much more convincing, once it improves to the point which is already being mooted, and I believe may be possible in some forms, of kind of implanting some of the technology directly into the brain so that it's experienced without the kind of relatively crude interface of a kind of plastic piano and a kind of an actual screen in front of you, but it's actually just going on in that way. What's it going to be like if it crashes in some sense? What's it going to be like if it goes down? We already see these kind of slightly crazed responses when the internet goes down. You certainly do at my house. I can tell you, when the internet goes down, there's a lot of baying and tramping and thudding around, and it really goes back to my initial worries 15 years ago, that there could be some kind of mass collective psychic crash involved if it were to go down. Computer games and video games, and asked me as a writer, maybe the late 80s I guess, to look at what I thought these games might be like. And again, I'm not saying I'm making great claims for my prescience, but what I did realise was that these were not going to be narrative mediums in the way that we commonly understood them. They were going to be narrative mediums, they were going to be games, and they were going to demand of the player that the player advance themselves incrementally using various forms of incentive. It doesn't follow rules. The rules that are, indeed, it seems to encourage a kind of fissiparous tendency in humans to break up into smaller and smaller agglomerations and to use it to find, as it were, kind of what they're looking for, usually in quite a dark way. And the other kind of pivotal experience for me around all of this virtual technology was actually a report I did for Philips, the electronics company, way back in the 1980s. And at that time they were looking at the very, very early, it's a kind of Gnostic view. It was kind of, very much a forward to the past view about what these technologies are. And I think there's some truth in that. People have always had an ulterior and imaginative life. Sometimes it's been collective. You can argue that various forms of religious experience, in some ways have an affinity with what people are doing when they engage with the World Wide Web through the internet. That many myriads of people are engaging in a world that is not immediately apprehensible to the senses, but can only be accessed through the We look at the way that the net has developed and its impact on people psychologically and collectively. In some ways it conforms to paradigms of imaginative experience that we've had in the past. I mean, it's not without accident that when that movie The Matrix came out, which seemed in many ways to presage or crystallize a lot of thinking about the virtual world, that people immediately referenced Gnosticism and said, this is in many ways a specialized set of devices, much as you might say that the religious experience can only be accessed through a specific set of rituals and through the interposition of certain kinds of kind of technological efficiency, if you like. So, maybe there is something going on here, that this is just another evolution of things humans have been doing for a long while. Where it differs, though, I think, is in the way that the kind of the web experience, the internet experience, is very fragmenting and very anomic.